The morning air at the military base was cold and still, carrying a quiet weight that settled over every person who walked across the wide concrete field. A long transport car moved slowly toward the runway, followed by a small group of soldiers who walked with steady steps. At the front of the group walked a respected colonel named David. His uniform was clean and pressed, his posture straight, and his eyes focused on the wooden case being carried behind him. Inside that case rested the remains of a young soldier named Tom, who had lost his life during a rescue mission. David had promised Tom's family that he would personally bring him home. It was a promise he carried with full honor. As he walked, he remembered the day he met Tom. The young man had been full of energy, always smiling and always ready to help anyone around him. He had called David not only his commander but also a mentor who guided him through every challenge. When the news of his loss came, it shook the whole unit. David stood in front of his team and told them he would be the one to escort Tom home. It was a moment of silence and respect, and everyone knew how much that promise meant to him. The air on the runway grew warmer as the sun rose. A plane stood ready near the gate, its steps lowered and its crew moving around it. David expected everything to go smoothly. He had completed all required paperwork. He had received approval from the command office. He had followed every rule. Now he only needed this final flight to take Tom back to his parents. David placed his hand gently on the case as the transport car halted. The soldiers beside him stood straight, waiting for his next instruction. David signaled to the driver to lower the case. When it touched the ground, he stepped forward and stood beside it for a brief moment. He whispered a quiet message for Tom, telling him that the journey home would be peaceful now. He then walked toward the gate where the airline agent stood. Her name was Mia, a young woman who had recently started her job. She held a tablet in her hands and gave a polite greeting when she saw him approaching. David introduced himself and handed her the documents that confirmed his escort duty. Mia scanned through the information and nodded. Everything seemed fine on her screen. She directed him to wait near the seating area while she checked with the flight manager to give final clearance for the transfer. David stepped back and took a seat, placing his cap gently on his lap. Around him, travelers moved through the terminal, unaware of the solemn duty he carried. A few minutes passed. Mia returned with a different look on her face. Something had changed. She held the tablet close to her chest and hesitated before speaking. David stood up, sensing her discomfort. Mia told him that the flight manager had asked for additional verification. She apologized for the delay and promised she would sort it out. David nodded patiently. He understood that procedures could take time. He told her he would wait as long as needed. As the minutes turned into nearly half an hour, the atmosphere around the gate shifted. 2 more airline staff joined Mia, speaking in hushed tones. They glanced at David several times. David felt a faint pressure in his chest, a sign that something more than simple paperwork was happening. He rose from his chair and approached them calmly, asking whether everything was all right. The staff exchanged looks before one of them stepped forward and explained that the flight manager had denied permission for him to board with the remains. David thought he misunderstood at first. He asked again, slowly, making sure he heard the words right. The agent repeated the decision, saying the manager believed the presence of a military escort with a case could disturb other passengers. The explanation sounded unclear, even unreasonable. David politely asked to speak with the manager directly. He believed a calm conversation could resolve the issue. The staff hesitated but agreed. When the manager arrived, he looked uneasy. He avoided eye contact and repeated the same reasoning. David explained his duty with steady composure. He spoke of the respect owed to a fallen soldier. He mentioned the approval from command and the formal documents. He remained calm, respectful, and clear. Still, the manager refused. He said the flight was full and any special transfer should have been requested earlier, even though David had already provided proof that it was. Around them, a few travelers began to notice the rising tension. Some whispered among themselves, sensing something serious was happening. David continued to speak with patience. He asked again for reconsideration. He reminded the manager that he was not asking for special treatment, but fulfilling a promise to bring a young man home to his grieving parents. He explained that the remains must not be delayed because the family was waiting at the receiving airport. The manager shook his head once more. The refusal stood. David felt a deep frustration rising inside him, but he kept his voice steady. He had faced danger in the field, carried responsibility for many lives, and dealt with loss more times than he could count. He had learned long ago that anger did not solve problems. He breathed in slowly and thanked the staff for their time, even though the decision filled him with disappointment. He walked back toward the case where Tom rested. The soldiers who had accompanied him looked at his face and understood immediately. They stepped closer, asking what had happened. David explained the situation in a quiet voice. Some of them looked shocked. Others lowered their heads in frustration. They had expected respect for the mission. They had expected understanding for the honor being carried. Instead, they faced refusal. David knelt beside the case again. He placed both hands on it, feeling the cold surface under his palms. He spoke softly, telling Tom he would not leave him behind. He would find another way. He would not break the promise he made. He stood up and told the soldiers they needed to call command for instructions. One soldier stepped aside and began making the call. While they waited, a small crowd formed a short distance away. Some had heard parts of the conversation. Some had seen the manager walk away with a troubled look. A young man stepped forward and approached Mia, asking what was happening. She explained that the escort officer was denied boarding despite having proper documents. The traveler shook his head and said it felt wrong. Others around him nodded. Soon the story began to spread among the passengers at the gate. People who had never met Tom and never met David found themselves moved by the situation. They whispered to each other that a fallen soldier deserved respect. They looked toward the officer standing beside the case, straight and silent, holding onto his promise with unwavering dignity. At that moment, a woman in her 40s walked toward David. She introduced herself as Anna. She said she had overheard the situation and wanted to thank him for the service he was doing for the young soldier. She explained that her own brother had served in the past, and she understood the weight of honoring someone who could no longer return home by his own steps. Her kind words eased a small part of David's frustration. He thanked her sincerely. As more passengers gathered, several of them walked to the counter and asked the staff why the escort was denied. They raised concerns and asked for the manager to come back. The pressure grew. The staff tried to calm the crowd but could not ignore the rising voices. Meanwhile, command called back, confirming that David had full authority to escort the remains and that no airline had the right to deny him unless there were severe and clear safety concerns. There were none. David returned to the counter with the new confirmation. The staff listened. Mia looked relieved, hoping this would fix the issue. But when she contacted the manager again, he still resisted. He said the decision was final. The tension grew sharper. Passengers around the gate watched the conversation unfold. Some stepped closer, ready to speak up again. David remained calm. He stood tall, his posture strong yet respectful. He had carried courage through storms far worse than this. He had faced nights when the only light came from distant fires. He had carried injured soldiers on his shoulders. He had written letters home for those who could no longer hold a pen. This moment hurt him, but it did not break him. He looked at the manager and spoke with quiet firmness, saying he would stay with the remains as long as needed. He would not leave until he found a way to bring Tom home. The crowd behind him watched with growing sympathy. Some pulled out their phones. Some whispered that they would not board until the officer was allowed to board as well. The pressure on the airline increased with every minute. The tension around the gate continued to rise as more passengers learned what was happening. Some had families of their own who served in the army. Others simply felt the natural respect owed to someone who had given his life in service. It did not matter that they had never met Tom. It did not matter that they did not know his story. What mattered was that a young man had fallen far from home, and that the officer before them had taken it upon himself to bring him back with honor. The refusal felt wrong to the crowd, and the air around the terminal carried that feeling clearly. David stood near the case, watching the reactions of people around him. He did not want trouble. He did not want argument. All he wanted was a safe passage for Tom. It was his promise. He would not turn it into a scene of conflict. While the passengers raised their voices, he remained calm, hoping a peaceful answer would come soon. Yet the clock continued to move and the flight time grew closer. The group of soldiers who had come with him stood in a silent line behind him. Their presence brought a quiet strength to the scene. They looked at their respected officer with full trust, knowing he would find a way to honor Tom even in this moment of stress. One of them stepped forward to whisper that command was ready to send a senior representative if needed. David nodded but asked them to wait. He believed there was still a path to solve this without escalation. Meanwhile, Mia struggled between her duty to follow instructions from the manager and her own sense of right and wrong. She kept looking toward the case, her heart heavy. She approached David again and apologized for the stress he was facing. He thanked her for her kindness. He told her he understood her position and that she was only following orders. His gentle tone surprised her. Even in a moment like this, he remained patient and respectful. Passengers continued to step forward. A middle-aged man approached one of the staff and asked loudly why the officer was denied. A young woman beside him said she would not board if a fallen soldier was not allowed the dignity he deserved. Another woman added that the decision made the airline look unfair. The voices grew more united. People lifted their tickets in their hands and told the staff they would wait until the officer was allowed to board. The manager returned to the gate when he heard the growing noise. He walked quickly, trying to calm the passengers. He asked them to take their seats and prepare for boarding. But the crowd did not move. They stood in place, firm in their decision. Some crossed their arms. Others stared directly at him with concern and disapproval. The manager felt pressure rising from all sides. David walked forward to speak with him again. His steps were slow and steady. He did not want to embarrass the manager. He did not want the situation to grow hostile. He simply wanted to present the truth calmly again. He explained once more that he had full approval from command and that the remains were prepared according to all safety standards. He repeated that the family was waiting. He mentioned that delaying travel would cause emotional pain to already grieving parents. He spoke with quiet strength. The manager looked around at the crowd watching him. He felt the weight of their eyes. Still, he insisted that he could not change the decision. He said the request had come too late. He said the airline policy gave him the authority to refuse special transfers at his discretion. The explanation felt thin to those who heard it. Some passengers shook their heads. Others whispered that his reasoning did not seem fair. David took a breath. His patience was strong, but this moment tested him deeply. He tried not to let the frustration show. He looked at the manager with composed eyes and said he would wait for the next flight if needed. But he added slowly that he hoped the airline would reconsider because he did not wish to delay Tom's journey longer than necessary. His voice carried a quiet sadness that touched many who heard it. The manager turned to leave. As he did, a young man from the crowd stepped forward and spoke loudly. He said that if the officer was not allowed to board, then he would cancel his ticket. Several others immediately agreed. A show of hands lifted in the air. People told the manager that they would stand with the officer. Their voices filled the gate with a growing unity that could not be ignored. The manager stopped again. He seemed unsure. He had not expected this reaction. The situation was no longer a simple internal decision. It had become a matter of public respect. He needed support, so he contacted the higher office of the airline. While he spoke on the phone, the crowd watched him closely. The tension felt like a held breath. As the minutes passed, David looked toward the glass windows of the terminal. He could see the sunlight stretching across the runway. He imagined Tom's parents waiting. He imagined their quiet home, the picture frames on the walls, the chair where Tom's mother probably sat each evening hoping for her son's safe return. His heart grew heavy. He felt a deep need to complete this journey, not because it was his duty, but because it was his promise as a leader and as a fellow human. A gentle voice pulled him back from his thoughts. It was Anna again, the woman who had spoken to him earlier. She stood beside him, offering a bottle of water. She told him she admired his strength. She said she believed the situation would resolve soon and that people here respected what he was trying to do. He thanked her with a sincere smile. Her presence brought a small comfort in the middle of the tension. The soldiers behind him shifted quietly as they watched the growing support from the crowd. One of them stepped closer and whispered that many passengers had begun recording the situation. David looked around and saw several phones held up. He did not like the idea of attention, but he understood why they felt the need to document the moment. He only hoped it remained peaceful. The manager finally returned from his call. His expression was serious. The crowd focused on him instantly. He looked at David, then at the case, then at the passengers who waited for his answer. He announced that the airline headquarters had instructed him to remain firm in his original decision. A wave of disbelief moved through the crowd. People murmured loudly. A few shook their heads in clear frustration. David stood silent. He absorbed the refusal slowly. He felt a deep ache, but he did not show it. He thanked the manager for relaying the answer, even though the decision brought him disappointment. He then stepped back toward the case. The soldiers followed. The crowd stirred restlessly. Then something unexpected happened. A young airline employee, who had been silent until now, walked toward the group. He approached the manager and spoke quietly but firmly. He said he believed the decision was wrong. He said the officer deserved respect. He said he would not assist with boarding until a proper choice was made. His courage surprised everyone around him. Another employee stepped forward. Then, another. Soon 5 airline workers stood together, telling the manager they could not support the refusal. The manager tried to reason with them, but their stance did not change. They felt the weight of the moment. They felt the truth behind the officer's calm and steady presence. The passengers cheered softly. Some clapped. The atmosphere shifted again. The manager felt cornered. He called headquarters once more. This time, he explained that both staff and passengers were refusing to proceed unless the officer was allowed to board. He waited for the response, pacing back and forth with nervous steps. David continued to watch silently. He did not encourage the crowd. He did not raise his voice. He stood with stillness, his hands behind his back, his eyes fixed on the wooden case. He wanted peace, not conflict. He did not want the young soldier's journey to become a source of unrest. He only wanted dignity for him. Finally, the manager returned, his posture different from before. His shoulders were lower, his expression tired. He cleared his throat and announced that the decision had been changed. The officer would be allowed to board. The remains would be handled with full respect. The announcement brought an immediate wave of relief through the crowd. People clapped loudly. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Mia rushed forward and apologized deeply to David. She said she would personally assist with the boarding process. He thanked her with quiet gratitude. The soldiers behind him stood straighter, feeling pride in seeing justice given. As the passengers stepped aside to open a path, David walked toward the case with slow and respectful steps. 2 soldiers lifted it carefully. The entire crowd grew silent. People placed their hands over their hearts. Some bowed their heads. Even those who did not fully understand military customs recognized the honor in the moment. David walked beside the case, his steps strong yet gentle. He felt the eyes of the whole terminal on him, but he did not walk for them. He walked for Tom. He walked for Tom's mother, who waited with quiet hope. He walked for Tom's father, who probably stood by the window every evening. He walked for every soldier who had ever trusted him. And he walked to uphold the promise he carried in his heart. As they approached the plane, the captain stepped out to greet him. The captain offered his hand and thanked David for the service he was doing for the young man. He promised that the case would be placed with complete care. His respectful tone touched David deeply. He shook the captain's hand firmly. Passengers lined the path. Some saluted. Some whispered thank you. Others simply watched with soft eyes. The united respect in the air felt warm and sincere. David felt a small heaviness lift from his heart. When he finally stepped onto the plane with the soldiers behind him, the cabin fell completely silent. People stood as he entered. He walked down the aisle with the quiet dignity of a man who carried not pride but duty. Part 2 ends here, as the officer finally boards with the remains after a long struggle, supported by strangers who recognized the honor he carried. When David entered the plane with the case carried gently behind him, the passengers moved aside with silent respect. They watched him walk down the aisle with calm steps that held the weight of duty and sorrow at the same time. The cabin lights were soft and warm, and the quiet hum of the engines filled the space. David felt a mixture of relief and sadness as he took his seat near the front. 2 soldiers sat a few rows behind him, keeping a respectful distance. The case was placed securely in the special compartment near the front of the plane, watched over by the captain and crew with full care. Once seated, David closed his eyes for a moment. The long struggle at the gate still echoed in his mind. He replayed the refusal, the tension, the support from the passengers, and the final approval. Most of all, he felt gratitude for the kindness of strangers who had stood with him without even knowing him or Tom. Their unity had made the journey possible. Still, his heart remained heavy because he knew that the most important part of his duty awaited him at the destination. He had to bring Tom to his family and face their grief with strength. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the captain made an announcement. His voice was steady and warm. He told the passengers that they had a military escort on board, accompanying the remains of a young soldier returning home. He asked everyone to keep this in mind during the flight. A soft whisper passed through the cabin as people acknowledged his message. David looked out the window, watching the runway lights blur as the plane accelerated. When the wheels lifted off the ground, he whispered a silent promise that Tom was finally going home. During the flight, the cabin remained calm. Many passengers chose to stay quiet out of respect. A few approached David politely to thank him for his service and his strength. A young father told him he hoped his own son would grow up with the courage and honor the officer carried. A woman said she would pray for the young soldier's family. David listened with gentle appreciation and thanked each of them. Their words brought a soft comfort to his tired heart. Hours passed. The sky outside shifted from blue to golden as the plane moved closer to the destination. David kept thinking about Tom's parents. He remembered the day he met them before the deployment. Tom's mother had hugged him tightly, telling him to watch over her son. Tom's father had shaken his hand firmly and thanked him for guiding the young man. Now those parents waited with heavy hearts for their son's return. David felt that weight deeply. He prepared himself to stand strong for them. The plane began its descent. The captain announced that they would be landing soon. The passengers sat upright, many of them glancing toward the front where the case rested. The respect in their eyes had not faded. When the wheels touched the ground and the plane slowed, a soft wave of relief moved through the cabin. David took a slow breath. The hardest moment was ahead, yet he carried strength within him born from honor and duty. When the doors opened, no one rushed to leave. Instead, the passengers waited as the crew approached David and signaled for him to stand. A pathway formed through the aisle as people stepped aside. Their silent respect created a gentle warmth around him. David walked forward with steady steps. The soldiers behind him followed. Outside, sunlight filled the walkway with a soft glow. As he exited the plane, he saw a small group standing on the tarmac. They were the honor guard assigned to receive Tom's remains. They stood in a perfect line with their uniforms bright under the sun. Behind them stood 2 older figures. Tom's parents. Their faces were pale with grief, yet full of quiet hope as they waited for their son. The sight struck David deeply. He paused for a moment to compose himself. The case was brought out with full care by the crew and soldiers. The honor guard lifted it gently and carried it toward the designated area where Tom's family waited. David walked beside them, his steps slow and respectful. Tom's mother covered her mouth as she watched the case move toward her. Tom's father placed a steady arm around her shoulders, though his own eyes were wet with tears. When the case was placed before them, Tom's mother stepped forward. She reached out and placed her hand on the smooth wood. Her fingers trembled as she whispered her son's name softly. Tom's father placed his hand beside hers and bowed his head. The moment was heavy with emotion. David felt his heart ache. He wished Tom could have come home alive. He wished he could have seen his parents again, smiled at them, and told them stories from his missions. But fate had taken him too early, and now this moment of farewell wrapped the air with sorrow. After a long silence, Tom's father looked up at David. His eyes were red but strong. He thanked David for bringing their son home. He said he knew the journey had not been easy. David bowed his head and replied that it was his honor and his promise. He told them that Tom had been brave and loyal. He shared a memory of how Tom had once helped a fellow soldier who had lost hope. The story brought soft tears to Tom's mother's eyes, yet also a small comfort. The honor guard prepared to move the case to the waiting vehicle that would take Tom to his hometown. Before they did, Tom's mother turned to David. She asked if he would accompany them to the final resting place. She said her son had spoken highly of him and that having David there would mean a great deal to them. David agreed without hesitation. He felt it was the right thing to do. The convoy began its journey. The road stretched long and quiet. David sat in one of the vehicles behind the family. He looked out the window at the fields and small towns they passed. Each place seemed calm and ordinary, yet he knew that today marked a deep and emotional moment for Tom's family. He hoped he could bring them some small peace by standing with them through the final steps. When they reached the town, people stood outside their homes waiting. Word had spread that a fallen soldier was returning home. Neighbors gathered on both sides of the road. Some held small flags. Others bowed their heads. Many placed their hands over their hearts. The entire town welcomed Tom with gentle love. David felt the sincerity in their quiet gestures. The convoy stopped near a small church where the final service would take place. The building was simple, with white walls and a tall wooden door. Inside, soft sunlight streamed through the windows. The honor guard carried the case inside and placed it at the front. The room filled slowly with people who had known Tom. Friends from school. Old neighbors, teachers. A few soldiers from nearby towns who had heard about Tom's return came to pay their respects. As the service began, the pastor spoke with a calm voice. He talked about Tom's courage, his kindness, and his willingness to help others. He spoke about the importance of honoring those who give their lives in service. Tom's parents sat close to the case, holding each other's hands tightly. David sat near them, his posture straight, his eyes steady. After the pastor finished, Tom's father stood. He thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about Tom's childhood, his dreams, and the pride he brought to their family. His voice trembled several times, but he kept speaking because he wanted everyone to remember his son not with sadness alone but with love and respect. When he finished, Tom's mother spoke briefly. She said her son had been a light in her life and that she prayed he would rest in peace now. The room was silent except for soft crying from scattered seats. Then the pastor invited David to speak. David stood slowly and walked to the front. He looked at the faces of the people gathered. He saw their grief and their love. He took a breath and spoke with steady calmness. He talked about the day he met Tom. He described Tom's courage and dedication. He shared how Tom had always helped his team, how he smiled even in difficult moments, and how he remained hopeful no matter how hard the mission became. He spoke with honesty and warmth, wanting to paint a clear picture of the young man he had known. The people listened closely. Some nodded softly. Others wiped tears. When David finished, he bowed his head and returned to his seat. Tom's parents looked at him with gratitude. They could feel how much their son had meant to him. After the service, the honor guard carried the case to the cemetery behind the church. The sun was lowering, casting a gentle golden light over the grass. Birds rested quietly in the nearby trees. The air felt peaceful. David walked beside the family as they followed the case. At the burial site, the honor guard stood in a neat formation. The pastor said a final prayer. Tom's mother placed a small photograph of her son on the case. Tom's father placed his hand over hers. As the case was lowered, Tom's mother cried softly. David placed a comforting hand on Tom's father's shoulder. He told him that Tom had been respected by all who served with him. He told him that his bravery would never be forgotten. Tom's father nodded with tears in his eyes. After the ceremony, people approached David to thank him for staying with the family. They said he had shown great strength and honor. David thanked them in return. He said he had simply kept a promise. He stood for a long time near the resting place, looking at the fresh earth. He felt a mix of sadness and peace. Sadness for the loss. Peace for keeping his word. Later that evening, Tom's parents invited him to their home for a simple meal. They wanted to share stories of Tom. David agreed. When he entered the home, he saw photographs of Tom on the walls. Pictures from school, from sports, from family trips. The house carried a warm feeling, filled with memories. Tom's mother served dinner quietly. Tom's father talked about the first time Tom said he wanted to join the army. David listened with gentle focus. As the night grew darker, the family thanked David again for everything he had done. They told him he would always be welcome in their home. David felt touched by their kindness. When he finally left, he looked up at the night sky and took a long breath. The journey had been heavy, but he knew he had done what he promised. He had brought Tom home. He had stood with the family. He had honored a life lived with courage. And though the airline had denied him at first, they later issued a written apology after learning how deeply the moment had affected the passengers and staff. They regretted their decision and promised better training. But for David, the apology mattered less than the fact that Tom was now home. With quiet steps, he walked away from the house, carrying the memory of the young soldier in his heart. The promise was complete, and the respect he had shown would stay with everyone who witnessed the journey.